just introduce myself. My name is Helge Blakkisrud. I'm a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs here in Oslo, and the head of NUPI's research group on Russia, Asia, and international trade, and have the pleasure to chair this panel, What is Putinism? And it was already raised during the first panel the question, is there such a thing as Putinism as an ideology? And if there is, what are Putinism's main features and characteristics? And if we accept that Putinism exists, either as a full-fledged ideology or more probably as a governance model, is there a future for Putinism beyond Putin? These are some of the questions that I hope we will be able to address over the next hour. And we have two excellent speakers that would help us navigate these waters. Maria Lipman, editor, researcher, columnist, for many years the editor of Pro et Contra, and more recently editor-in-chief of the journal Counterpoint. And I would like to add a constant source of insightful and thought-provoking analysis of Russian politics and society. And she's joined by Benjamin Nathans, Associate Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, the author of the award-winning book Beyond the Pale about Jewish encounters with Imperial Russia, and now finalizing another big project on the Soviet dissident movement, a project that will end up in a book called To the Success or Hopeless Cause, History of the Soviet Dissident Movement. After having taken a sneak peek into their presentations, I suggest that we go in the opposite order than what you are listed in the program. And I would just like to give the floor to Ben first. He will speak for 20 minutes. Marshall will have 20 minutes, and then we'll hopefully also have some time for a discussion and Q&A. We will steal a little time of the lunch break, so we'll go on for about 1 hour before we wrap up. But without further ado, Ben, please.
Thank you, Helge. Thank you to the organizers of the conference for bringing me and for bringing all of us together for today's conversation. If I were to propose a title for my talk, it would be, There is no such thing as Putinism, and Western pundits created it. I want to suggest that there have been two traditional scenarios for understanding the role of ideology in Russia. One argues that Russia is hardwired to require an ideology for itself. It argues that Moscow had the theory of the Third Rome. The Soviet Union positioned itself as the vanguard of the international proletariat, and in general was the most purpose-driven society that the world has ever seen. And the argument continues that today's Russia is simply genetically incapable of functioning without a sense of collective purpose and an ideological vision to describe it and capture it. As a matter of fact, the argument is that Russia is the last European state to have such a powerful sense of collective mission as embodied in ideological thinking. The second scenario says the exact opposite, that ideology really doesn't matter very much in Russia today, that there's been a sense of exhaustion with a purpose-driven society, and that this exhaustion was visible long before 1991. Not so much that Soviet ideology had died, but that it was hollowed out and had become less and less a source of actual policy making and strategic thought. This second school argues that Russia today is essentially a mafia state, a kleptocracy, and as we all know, mafias do not require elaborate ideologies in order to function. If there's only a single governing idea in Russia today, according to this second school, it is greed. That is the only ideology that matters. And in any event, the vast majority of Russians, according to this school, are very much like people in Europe and the United States. They are consumers, and consumerism is the only ideology that really governs both the psychology and the behavior of the Russian population. So if I could sum up the second school, all of the isms have become wasms. It's not so easy to think about the way ideology functions in Russia today because it's a complicated place. On the one hand, my impression, and certainly I'm not the only one, is that Russia is an exceptionally cynical place. That is, public culture is highly cynical, with extraordinary levels of corruption, arguably the most corrupt among the industrialized countries in the world. On the other hand, anybody who has spent time in Russia knows that it has a vibrant high culture, that intellectual life is extremely vigorous there, and that there are still the remnants of an intelligentsia, that is, a class of people that defines itself by its relationship to ideas. So this is not an easy task to discern what the role of ideological thinking is in today's Russia. I'm an historian by training, and the first impulse that I have when trying to tackle this problem is to think about it historically. And one of the things that we've learned from the Soviet experience, that is the experience that formed the childhoods and young adulthoods of all of the people who are currently in power in Russia, is that ideology can be an actor historically in many different modes, in many different ways. Probably the most coherent ideology to have been extracted from the Soviet experience was Stalinism. But I want to remind you that even though Stalin's collected works comprise 13 volumes, and that there was a time when people spoke about Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, as if they were all analogous, unlike Marxism and Leninism, Stalinism was also a real existing system. It was a set of political arrangements. It was a certain version of a society and of relations between society and the state. So the first thing we have to be clear about when we ask ourselves, is there such a thing as Putinism, is, are we talking about this Putinism as a set of ideas that is captured textually and that people debate and discuss? Or are we talking about Putinism as a set of pragmatic political arrangements from which we can extract a set of implicit ideas about how things work or are supposed to work? My own view is that there is no body of theory that could be usefully described as Putinism. There is no clear Putin doctrine that we can show consistently at work in the formulation and exercise of policy in Russia, despite strenuous efforts by Western commentators to construct one. Instead, what we have is a set of arrangements that is now roughly 2 decades old, and I would argue we should approach Putinism the way an anthropologist would approach a society. That is, to try to tease out the implicit norms and cognitive structures that are embedded in widespread practices. And if we do this, I'm going to argue, we will find that Putinism is something that is not just in the Kremlin. The same anthropological arrangements apply to much of Russian society today. When he became president 18 years ago, Putin solemnly declared, and I am quoting, "I am opposed to the restoration of any kind of official state ideology in Russia." There have been many nominations for what is allegedly more or less official ideology in Russia today, contrary to Putin's own initial statement. So we've seen discussions of Russian orthodoxy, of Eurasianism, of anti-globalism, anti-Westernism, and of course various versions of Russian nationalism. We've also seen extensive analyses, certainly in the American media, of which thinkers are provide the key philosophical roots either to Putin's thinking or to Putin's policies. If you follow these debates, then names such as Ivan Ilyin, Konstantin Danilevsky, Lev Gumilyov will be familiar to you. What all three of these thinkers, and I could have mentioned others, what all of these thinkers have in mind is that they were born over a century ago. And so if we take at face value the notion that they are the philosophical sources of Putin's policies, we would have to immediately conclude that this is an extraordinarily conservative regime, possibly even reactionary. My sense, however, is that the occasional quotations from these and other thinkers that we find in the speeches and programmatic statements of Putin and other Russian leaders are not much more than intellectual gloss or post facto legitimation of policies that were decided on bases having nothing to do with these thinkers and their texts. Let me give you a few examples. Eurasianism is often invoked as a body of thought from the early 20th century that informs Putin's worldview and that of the Kremlin writ large. I see very little evidence, however, that Eurasianism as a doctrine has actually shaped Kremlin policies in the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, or indeed in its relationship with China and other Asian states. And in fact, no matter what Putin may have said or done, it is China and not Russia that is making the concept of Eurasia a reality. That is the salient fact, not an alleged intellectual debt that Putin might have to Gumilyov or other Eurasianists. I would also argue that instead of parsing the speeches for quotations, signals being sent to fans of Eurasianism, we should bear in mind the fact that of Russia's population of roughly 100 million people, only 30 million live east of the Ural Mountains. And as long as the overwhelming majority of Russia's population lives in the European parts of Russia, Russia will continue to be oriented towards and obsessed with the West, not with Asia, Eurasia, or Inner Asia. Another example, nationalism. I want to remind you that Russians as a people have almost no historical experience living in a nation state. That is not a political arrangement that has informed Russian historical consciousness. Their experience over the last 5 decades has always, 5 centuries, has always been with one or another form of empire, whether Romanov or Soviet. And within those various imperial formations, the Russians have always been the dominant ethnic group. And this, I think, more than any citation to various nationalist thinkers, whether it's Danilevsky or Ilyin or others, this helps us explain why Russians collectively seem incapable of belonging to alliance systems in which they are either equal or subordinate figures. This is simply not part of their historical experience. The various attempts that have been made by the Kremlin to institutionalize some form of nation building, to make it concrete, have not been terribly successful. Think back to the year 2003, if you remember, the Kremlin creating a nationalist party, Rodina. After an initial surge of popularity and membership, it fizzled out and disbanded in 2007. Think back to the official sponsorship of the youth movement, Nashi, which many compared to the Hitlerjugend, in its attempt to galvanize nationalist sentiment among post-Soviet youth. This too has proved to be a short-lived experiment, not at all comparable with the longevity and effect of the Komsomol, the youth organization organized by the Soviet Communist Party. The discussion of whether there is an ideology behind Russian policymaking today is of far more than purely academic interest. I want to remind you of some of the dangers of assuming a coherent ideology, whether we want to call it Putinism or something else. When you assume that there is a coherent body of thought behind policymaking, and that has clear, far-reaching, ambitious agendas to set politically, such as resurrecting the Soviet Union, or resurrecting the Russian Empire, or restoring the Cold War so that Russia can occupy its place as the superpower. When you assume those kinds of forms of coherence, I think you run into the same kind of dangers that happened during the Cold War, when certainly the United States saw every instance of left-leaning or communist insurgents as part of a master plan organized by Moscow, arranged by Moscow, and controlled by Moscow. And I don't need to remind people in this room to what disastrous consequences that way of interpreting Russian intentions led. Remember that when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979, the American National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, argued that this was not really about Afghanistan. This was the beginnings of a Soviet push to control the Persian Gulf, part of a master plan of world domination. That's the kind of thinking that assumes coherence where there is none. Another important reason not to hasten to assume that there is a coherent ideology at work in the Kremlin today is that it would distract from what I think is the real explanation of Soviet politics, and that this is a society that is still fundamentally ruled by informal practices. And I say that not just about the Kremlin and the low level of institutionalization of power, its highly personal nature, but of Russian society writ large. This is a country that is famous for its unwritten rules, and has been famous for its unwritten rules for a very long time, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. The way sociologists describe this informal nature of power is through the word systema. This is a set of arrangements that people mistakenly think is Putinism, but is actually much older. If you insist on Putinism being real and useful as a category, it's just the latest label that is attached to the phenomena of systema. And this is the informal series of networks of patronage and informal practices. This is the deep Russia, which was there before Putin was born and will be there after he dies. Despite his image as an all-powerful Tsar, Putin has actually never managed to build an efficient, bureaucratically successful state apparatus. He has simply mastered the art of manipulating the systema, this practice of informal decision-making, at which he is truly skilled. An earlier speaker today quoted the political technologist Gleb Pavlovsky, who also has quite a bit of experience with the Kremlin, and I also want to offer a different quotation from him. He said, and this is someone who's an eyewitness to the internal proceedings, he said, "At meetings, Putin asks specific questions of his subordinates, and they supply answers. There is no larger discussion. His decision-making has become almost purely reactive. It is based not on goals, but rather on current threats." End quote. One of the qualities of systema, of this network of informal practices and patronage relationships, is that the state enjoys almost unlimited access to all natural resources. And I think this was part of what Maxime was getting at this morning when he cautioned us against thinking of Russia as a market capitalist system. The state ultimately has the say over all national resources. The state practice of doling out these resources, of siphoning them off, of using various corrupt practices to increase the personal wealth of high officials, all of this produces grumbling and anger among much of the Russian population. But I want to emphasize that ordinary Russians themselves are fully embedded in this network of informal practices. And in fact, they are proud of it, because these informal practices are what make life bearable. They are what make it possible to get things done, to work around regulations and rules that are perceived as cruel or impractical. Indeed, for Russians, informal practices are not an option, they are a necessity. And the range of people in Russian society at all levels who are forced to engage in informal practices as part of their everyday lives is enormous. It is virtually ubiquitous and comprehensive. In this sense, the push for the rule of law and for law-based governance is in tension with Russian norms, Russian popular norms of circumventing the law in order to make life easier and more bearable. So the constant presence of evasion, adaptation, circumvention, working around established structures is simply inseparable from Russian life writ large. For the first decade or so of his rule, Putin was able to work with and bypass some of these practices through what I would call an informal social contract. He was able to preside over rising incomes and higher living standards in return for the population's acquiescence from political activism. With the global financial crisis of 2008, and above all, the collapse of the oil and gas market, and then the imposition of sanctions by the West, that social contract no longer became as viable as it had been. And this is where you see the beginnings of a more ideological or idea-based approach to governance. This is where Putin starts to turn to so-called traditional values. This is where he starts mentioning things like Eurasianism and the sort of 1,000-year history of the Russian state. These are all alternative means to achieve the kind of legitimacy that the earlier social contract had provided. I don't want to diminish the significance of this appeal to traditional values. I don't want to diminish the significance of the Russian state's persecution of sexual minorities, of its positioning of itself as standing for the values that it claims Europe used to stand for in the earlier 20th century. All I want to assert in this context is that I think it's a mistake to see this as simply a propaganda drive by the Kremlin, and to see the qualities of militarism and secrecy and professional conformism and the belief that the ends justify the means as a basis for politics, and the, to my mind, extraordinarily peculiar argument that you hear almost daily from Russia, which is that don't criticize us for doing X, you do it yourself. What other great power makes an argument that amounts to two wrongs make a right? It's an extraordinary way of moral reasoning. My point is that all of this is not unique to the Kremlin. It gives me no pleasure to say this, but I think those attitudes are extremely widespread in the Russian population itself. I think that it's a mistake to look at Putin and other Russian leaders as if they come from another species. They come from the same human material as Russian society writ large. And they display the same characterization that the great Soviet writer Yuri Trifonov once used in what I think was a Norwegian documentary film about the bard Vladimir Vysotsky. Trifonov said of Vysotsky, he captured like no one else the characteristic Russian combination of boldness and despair. And that is what I see in today's Kremlin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, for guiding us through the various isms that compete for influence in the Kremlin. You had a list there of nationalism, anti-Westernism, anti-globalism, Eurasianism. One ism that I missed was conservatism. And I recently heard the driving idea behind the Kremlin described as national conservative sovereignty. What would be your take on the role of conservatism? If you can say a few words about that briefly before we give the floor to Masha.
Thank you. I do want to be very brief so that you have adequate time. You're right, conservatism should be in that list, although that's an extremely broad, almost amorphous category. And I know that Masha's going to have something important to say about what it means to be traditional in today's Russia, so I won't go into that. But I think if there's one ism that spans the different versions of Putin that we've seen since the end of 1999 to today, it is conservatism. So I would agree with you.
I have to start with an apology for my voice. I hope you can hear me, but I cannot speak louder than now. So please be merciful. Thank you very much to all the organizers for this wonderful opportunity to speak here in this very distinguished company. So it's really a challenge to speak about something that doesn't exist, Putin's regime's ideology. As you will see, we exchanged notes, Benedens and myself, and we realized that we generally agree on the big picture. What I will be talking about is mostly adding concrete details to that picture. So what I am going to speak about is what drove the Kremlin to resort to ideological tools. And from now on, I will use this word in quotation marks, ideological, ideology, etc. So what is this ideology about is the second thing. Who are the ideological entrepreneurs? And what is the impact of the Kremlin's ideological operation on the Russian public? I would argue that the Kremlin's primary objective is not to inculcate a certain set of beliefs, let alone a creed or a doctrine, but to minimize the risks of the public factor. So public sentiments, public perceptions, public activities would not undermine the Kremlin's political dominance. And the latter, the Kremlin's dominance, is regarded as the pillar of stability, the regime's overarching goal. In order to minimize the risks to stability, the Kremlin is engaged in permanent adjustment and readjustment. And this applies not just to ideology. This applies to all spheres of governance. And this echoes what Ben Naden said about the informal element of governance. This operation is generally defensive or reactive. In the realm of ideas and symbols, the primary aim is to protect the broad public from the ideological entrepreneurs who are deemed dangerous. So their ideas would not interfere with the general mood of acquiescence. Liberals and westernizers appear to be major adversaries, but even more loyal entrepreneurs may be seen as a liability, not an asset, if they get excessively zealous. The Kremlin's operation is facilitated by the fact that people at large still tend to accept the Kremlin dominance as the political status quo that is preferable to any change. And as one commonly hears in focus groups, just please let them not try to make it better. Keep it as is. In 2000, Putin inherited the nation in a state of economic misery and political turmoil, with all institutions, including the presidency, dropped basically to zero level. Putin undertook to bring back stability by reinstating the habitual Russian pattern of government, heavily centralized power with an unchallenged and uncontested leader, himself, at the top. In the state-society relations, this policy was that of stability through demobilization. Since his very first days in office, Putin repeatedly voiced concern about societal divisions and emphasized the need for unity, social accord, and reconciliation. National television and official rhetoric also emphasized the point that Putin is a uniter, a uniter yearned for by the nation. Rather than offering a new unifying idea or ideas, what Putin did, what Kremlin did under his guidance, was opting for muffling the existing differences, first and foremost by marginalizing the discourse about the past that was tearing the nation apart in the 90s. The tactic, however, was not that of reconciliation, rather that of pacification. A striking example is the improbable triad of the Russian state symbols, the Soviet anthem, the flag associated with Yeltsin's victory over communism, and the Tsarist emblem. Putin has consistently avoided the issue of the origins of Russian statehood, trying to present Russian history as an uninterrupted continuum, which is kind of bizarre given how many ruptures Russia lived through in the 20th century. At least twice Russian statehood collapsed, in 1917, of course, in 1991. Back in 2000s, the policy of demobilization came naturally because the price of oil was rising and the government was able to deliver it to the people. So what actually drove the Kremlin to resort to ideological instruments? In 2011 and 2012, two factors called for ways to reconsolidate the legitimacy that was on decline as Russian economic growth slowed down, and also because of the 2011 and 2012 mass protests. So among the ways to reinstate, to reconsolidate the legitimacy, the Kremlin opted for using ideology, using ideological instruments. What were those instruments? I think three main elements of the Kremlin ideological shift can be identified. First is the emphasis on Russian greatness, what sometimes is referred to as державный nationalism, great power nationalism. There is nothing new about that. Putin actually spoke about it at length as far back as very late '99 in his Millennium Manifesto. He probably didn't write it, but signed it and it was published. And in that manifesto, he spoke indeed at length about how Russia is great, has to be great, and there is no way for Russia to act in the world. Now, the second element is strong anti-Western and anti-liberal stance in order to discredit the excessively modernized and westernized constituencies. Again, not new, but significantly strengthened. And the third was the traditional values and social conservatism. Boris Dubin, Russian, very brilliant, unfortunately no longer with us, Russian, very insightful sociologist, described the state-society relations in the 2000s as the state that doesn't intrude. It sounds even better in Russia, государство, которое не достает. In 2010s, however, the Kremlin policy shifted to broad encroachment on private and public spheres, such as family, sex, faith, art and culture, etc. And a major shift was from Putin the uniter. Putin evolved as Putin the divider, pitting the conservative Putin majority against the excessively modernized Russians, the unpatriotic minority. Who are the ideological entrepreneurs? Putin himself evolved as one briefly in the period from 2011 to 2014, when he made strong statements about history, including in addressing historians and acting as a mentor, as a senior colleague maybe. Also, as he spoke about moral issues, portraying Russia as a bulwark of traditional European values, including those of morality and Christianity. But as of 2015, he has barely touched upon these issues, either lost interest or probably was preoccupied otherwise. Foreign policy became very important. The Kremlin's ideological turn, however, has unleashed and invigorated quite a range of ideological entrepreneurs. They may or may not be staunch loyalists, but they all share the anti-liberal stance. And they differ from the Kremlin that where the Kremlin is vague, these entrepreneurs quite often have more definitive statements in very articulate messages that sometimes strongly disagree from one group of ideological entrepreneurs to another. Major players in that field would be the Russian Orthodox Church, Russian communists, FSB, that is state security, and the military-industrial complex through their think tanks, business sponsors, etc. The general public, I would say, is not over-agitated about issues having to do with ideas and symbols. The Kremlin plays a delicate balancing act. The expression goes to Marlène Laruelle, a colleague of mine from George Washington University, between these groups so that all of them stay on board. A striking example of disagreement between powerful ideological entrepreneurs was the centenary of the Bolshevik Revolution last year in 2017. The centenary and the event was looked as a cause for grand celebration by the communists, but as a tragedy by the Russian Orthodox Church. While the Communist Party of the Russian Federation celebrated, the church carried a reliquary with relics of the neo-martyrs, that is, the clergy who were executed by the Bolsheviks around Russia. Caught in this clash of visions, the Kremlin preferred to stay silent, leaving the stage for those with strong opinions. The Russian Orthodox Church increasingly claims the role of the major ideological entrepreneur, as with the history park, Russia My History, which was originally established in Moscow and now expanded to about 24 Russian cities that have copies of that history park. The version, the historical narrative that you find in that historical park is ultra-conservative, and the government is generally supportive of this initiative. However, the school curriculum, sponsored, of course, and approved by the state, is much more balanced than the version of history presented in the history park, Russia My History. Though the regime has turned more ideological, and again, all in quotation marks, rather we can be talking about the regime using or drawing on ideological instruments, among others, the policy of obfuscation and intentional blurriness that marked Putin's earlier tenure remains in place. This policy ensures flexibility, again, something I think that Ben Nathan's called informality. And this is a key feature of the regime of unrestricted authority, unbound by any laws, institutions, obligations, or commitments. Flexibility comes in very useful for adjusting and readjusting that I mentioned in the beginning. One of the striking examples of blurriness is the treatment of Stalin. Putin mentions Stalin very rarely, almost solely in response to a direct question. Last time this happened when Oliver Stone asked him the question about Stalin. What Putin says may not amount to an outright condemnation, but it doesn't amount to a rehabilitation either. Stalinists, however, are a substantial ideological group, or again, entrepreneurs. If one looks at shelves in Russian bookstores, where you find quite a lot of Stalinist literature, which is in high demand. Another piece of evidence is Stalin busts that have appeared all around Russia in several dozen Russian cities. However, all of those busts were the initiative of local communists, and none is in broad public view in the main square. They are private initiatives, and a private initiative, as applies to statues, does not require a permission. If you want to erect a monument in the main street or square somewhere where it can be seen by many people, you need an official permission. Just very, very recently, in Novosibirsk, local communists tried and launched a campaign to erect a real statue of Stalin, but lost their cause. Before that, in 2010, then Moscow Mayor Yuri Lushkov also launched an initiative, not of a statue, but he wanted to decorate Moscow in time for the Victory Day in May, commemorating, of course, the victory in World War II, with wartime posters, some of which portrayed Stalin, and also lost his cause. Stalin remains a highly divisive figure for reasons that have been discussed countless times in the past couple of decades, which is one reason why Putin is evasive. Another reason is whether or not Putin cares about Stalin. What he apparently cares about much more is that the power of the state would not be compromised. For the same reason, Putin and Kremlin consistently avoid the issue of perpetrators of mass terror. One more reason for avoiding this issue is that a super important political actor and ideological entrepreneur, that is FSB, state security, takes pride in its ancestry in the Soviet secret police, such as NKVD or Cheka, etc. Mass repressions per se are a less controversial issue, and Irina Prokhorova mentioned the solemn ceremony that we have every year in downtown Moscow, right in front of the former KGB, now FSB building, by the way, reading the names of those who were executed by Stalin. But the rhetoric of the Kremlin and Putin personally on repressions per se, as opposed to the perpetrators, is much more definitive. And last year, on the Kremlin's initiative, actually Putin's personal initiative, we finally had the first ever national memorial, not local, but national memorial to the victims of political repressions. Putin attended the inauguration of the memorial, and his speech was fully appropriate to the cause. The Kremlin switched to a mobilization mode at the time of the annexation of Crimea and the hot phase of the war in Donbass. And the use of ideological tools was further intensified as the war went on. The very aggressive and raw propaganda created an image of Russia as a fortress under siege. But in 2015, the government toned it down and switched back, at least in part, to the habitual demobilization mode. Why is that? I think because this raw propaganda unleashed undesired sentiments and perceptions and even behavior. And Igor Stelkov, a commander, or however you describe him, who went to fight in Donbass from Moscow, was gaining a reputation of somewhat of a national hero, which was not to the Kremlin liking. And also, the way Russian men went to fight in Donbass en masse, I don't mean those quote-unquote volunteers that the Kremlin sent. I mean those who went there on their own. And again, this kind of activism was arguably not to the Kremlin liking. Arguably, because the Kremlin unleashed undesired sentiments by its ideological shift, incidents of such collateral damage of unleashed energies that are not to Kremlin liking have become quite numerous. Usually it has to do with undesired and violent behavior of ultra-conservative, obscurantist, fundamentalist nature, including acts of violence and vandalism, from ugly assaults on gay teens to acts of vandalism at art exhibits or worshipping ugly idols such as Ivan the Terrible. Actually, the examples are too many. But in fact, the official stance remains fuzzy on most issues related to ideas and symbols. Let me get to the national pantheon. Who are today's Russian national heroes? An interesting question. Back in 2013, Putin said the nation should have its own heroes and people should know them. Now, who are the heroes that the nation respects? There is still no clarity on who belongs to the Russian post-Soviet pantheon. If you look at public opinion polls, the top 10, you see 9 figures who belong totally to the Soviet pantheon of national heroes, and 1 new figure. And you can easily guess who the new figure is. Of course, it will be a set of figures who were either broadly recognized and glorified in the Soviet days, or who were not broadly recognized, such as Vysotsky, for instance, but essentially they are still Soviet. Putin is the only one who is new on that list. It is interesting that both the mostly invisible Stalin, as I mentioned, there are no street names, no statues except for those busts, and the ubiquitous Lenin, which is a totally different story, right? Lots of statues, lots of streets, etc. They hold very high position among the top 10 most important Russians in the public opinion polls, though neither is promoted by the Kremlin. On rare occasions when Putin mentioned Lenin, he spoke negatively about him. So the attempt to add pre-Soviet figures to the national pantheon has given it a somewhat monarchical flavor. I'm now not talking about the top 10, but hardly strengthened national unity around new names. So in today's Russia, each has his and her own czar to adore. 2 monarchs, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, are the legacy of the Soviet popular historiography. Russian liberals sought to commemorate Alexander II. Putin seems to favor Alexander III and Stolypin, not a monarch, but a very important statesman of the turn of the 20th century. some including former Oryol governor Edor Ivan the Terrible. The church has canonized Nicholas II, and the cult of the last Soviet Tsar has quite a powerful following. But Putin barely appreciates a ruler who lost his country and was killed, and he said almost as much on one occasion. Same fuzziness applies to national holidays and, to ideas and thinkers. Ben Nathan spoke about Lev Gumilyov and this realm of ideas. I would add to that that one, of course, should not jump to conclusions based on quotes that Putin used. Whenever the Kremlin staff is reshuffled and new appointees come in, they tend to pick their own favorite thinkers. And production of ideas is usually outsourced to friendly think tanks. Some of quotes from Ilyin, and this, I think, was something that attracted a lot of attention by Western scholars, are associated with a time when the person in charge of these matters in the Kremlin administration was Vyacheslav Volodin, who is no longer there, who actually promoted Berdyaev, another thinker, but the two were not on good terms and exchanged really vicious exchange, Ivan Ilyin and Berdyaev. But now Volodin is gone. And the person who replaced him is Sergei Kiriyenko. I do not know whether still high-ranking officials are trained in reading Berdyaev's works, which was the case under Volodin. But last year it was reported that training of prospective high-ranking officials included jumping off a 7-meter cliff. So quite a different approach. So social conservatism and traditional values are arguably the weakest element of the Kremlin's ideology. And what the Kremlin certainly is not, and Putin is not, is a moral authority. The very notion of traditional is very hard to apply to Russia, where traditions were thoroughly eradicated in the first half of the 20th century. So does tradition imply Soviet tradition or pre-revolutionary tradition or both is not clear. Despite the talk about traditional values, people at large are generally left to their own pursuits in their tastes, habits, lifestyle, etc. The Russian Orthodox Church, which is also, of course, an important ideological entrepreneur in Orthodoxy, is cited as one of the ideologies. It is respected as an institution, and when the Kremlin passed a law criminalizing offending the religious believers' feelings, it was generally approved by a majority. However, encroachments on personal spaces are not appreciated by the Russian Orthodox Church or whoever. And I'm talking here about instances, I think Misha Garbovich showed one of those, when developers built church buildings in public parks, or when St. Isaac Cathedral, when the church claims the property of St. Isaac Cathedral in St. Petersburg, or when the church lobbies for introducing religious lessons in schools. The Russian Orthodox Church is not a moral authority either, not in a large scale. For a small minority maybe, but not in a large scale. A Russian expert on the Russian Orthodox Church and its relations on the society said recently, Russian people are not against the Russian Orthodox Church, but they prefer that it know its place. I will finish. The rise of державный nationalism, great power nationalism, is arguably the most successful achievement of the Kremlin's ideological turn. It achieved one interesting goal since the annexation of Crimea. Great nation nationalism has largely superseded ethnic nationalism. And it is interesting that contrary to the trend in many European countries, ethnic nationalism in Russia is on decline. Quite an achievement, whether or not it will hold. Russian greatness, the sense of we belong to a great nation, has been easy to inculcate because it draws on a pre-existing condition. In a recent public lecture, Stephen Kotkin, a prominent Russian historian, spoke about a centuries-long pattern. And I think this word pattern has come up in several presentations here already. He says the pattern reproduces itself in Russia time and time again. He describes this pattern as a gap between Russia's aspirations to be not just a regular but a special country, and the wherewithal and the capacity of the Russian state that is not as powerful as it aspires. If there is one tradition about Russia, Soviet or pre-Soviet, it is that. This leads, Kotkin continues, to have recourse to the state as an instrument, as a lever to push and kind of bully the society forward in a drive to make up the difference, at least to manage the gap with the most powerful nations. This pattern can be easily traced in today's Russia. The state has delivered and reinforced a sense of greatness that consolidated the regime's legitimacy. Life around may be rife with inequality and injustice, and yet the same state that produces and reproduces such ills has boosted people's ego by reminding them of Russia's heroic history, first and foremost, the victory in World War II, about Russia's military might, about special Orthodox spirituality, about global stature, and the return of Crimea to the Russian fold. The public has remained generally acquiescent, and status quo is deemed preferable to any change. Troublemakers are looked upon with suspicion, and since 2014 until very recently, Putin's approval remains sky high. And I will wrap up. Let me turn to Kotkin one more time. The recourse to the state works for a time and produces some results at high cost. Yet nonetheless, invariably, it gets into a kind of bogged down quagmire situation. This past summer and fall, a pension reform introduced against the backdrop of several years of economic stagnation left people strongly disaffected. Putin's rating dropped from over 80 to under 70, and though he still remains fully unchallenged and a leader of no alternative, this decline, combined with several electoral failures in September, raises the question of whether the regime or the regime's legitimacy begins to erode again, and if so, what instruments, ideological or otherwise, the Kremlin may use to give it a new boost.
Thank you very much, and sorry for rushing you, but we got the shortest time of all the panels, although we have the most interesting topic. Before we open the floor for some short questions, I would just like to ask both of you the unavoidable question in a panel about Putinism 2024. You said, Moshe, that people would say, please do not try to make it better, just give us stability. But how long can you feed off stability? There seems to be nothing else to offer. Well, it was foreign policy during Putin's previous term, but can he take it all to 2024 and secure a succession with just giving the people more of the same? So if you could reflect on that, both of you, briefly, before we open the floor.
Well, you all know the line that historians use. I have no idea what's going to happen next week, but as soon as it does, I'll explain why it was inevitable. I have no idea what's going to happen in 2024, but it seems to me that Putin is a man in excellent health, and I wouldn't be surprised if he remains president after 2024. And he can find some kind of constitutional loophole to make that happen. I don't think stability alone will suffice in order to maintain his levels of popularity. I think a lot will depend on whether the price of oil rises, and I'm sure it will between now and 2024, since it's so extremely low at the present time. But I don't sense any clear macro agenda on the horizon of this administration, something around which popular opinion could galvanize. I see it as a very reactive administration, and so the question really is, to what will it be reacting over the next 6 years? And that, I have no idea.
I agree with Ben Nathan's again. I really don't know. I don't think anybody does. I have a strong belief in the Kremlin's ability to adjust and readjust. I think if there is one skill that the Kremlin has mastered over the years, actually honed to perfection, is responding to challenges as they arise. The processes in the society that were discussed in the previous channel, very important, totally deserve the attention, and all of us will continue to observe them, still are happening in the society that, as an actor, the society at large is very weak. And that is also a perennial pattern of Russia. Strong state in a sense that it has control, not in the sense of efficiency, as you mentioned. So a omnipotent state in a virtually powerless society. This has been the pattern. This is a pattern that is accepted, but up to a point. And there was one word, actually, Misha Gabovich used that I really appreciated in this respect, is the word head-on. People find ways, just like the government does. People are very good at adjusting too. They at least at this point in time, they don't believe in attacking the government head-on. This is seen as quixotic, as suicidal, certainly pointless, and of course risky. But there are all kinds of ways to adjust. And if the status quo, the political status quo, is the preferable choice, both at the high level of government and among the society, I think the two will find a way to adjust and readjust whatever happens.
Okay, we'll take 2 quick questions, and please make them short because you will be eating away from our lunch break and you will become very unpopular. So I have Paul Koster first, and then Maxime.
Paul Koster, University of Oslo. Thank you for 2 very stimulating talks. First to Professor Nathans. I completely agree with you that it's not very fruitful to focus on isms as such and ideology. But it seemed to me that you made a sort of an exception for neo-traditionalism, if you did, I completely agree, because it has been fleshed out in specific legislation, in tightening the abortion law, and the anti-gay legislation, and the blasphemy law, and decriminalizing violence in close relations. As Marsha Lipman said, it seems that these moves are not particularly popular in the Russian population. So if the government then seems, or the Kremlin seems to be concerned about boosting legitimacy, but is it undermining it? You said on the one hand that the regime is not leaving the population to their own devices, but you also said that it has become more intrusive. So has it unleashed dark forces which they cannot control? Well, we believe that they can control it, but is it a dangerous game they're playing?
So if you didn't get lunch, then blame it on Paul. Maxime.
Yeah, very quick. My question to Marsha Lipman. Ideology. What do you think about Tim Snyder's book about the unfreedom and the Russian fascism, Putin being essentially a Russian fascist, and Ivan Ilyin? So, to what extent do you think it's reasonable?
Who wants to go first?
On Timothy Snyder's book, I strongly disagree. So that I'm not blamed for a delayed lunch, I would refer you to an article by Marlène Laruelle, exactly devoted to Snyder, and I think making very strong points against his thinking. Talking about on abortion, I think it is very important. Abortion has been on decline in Russia. The statistics on abortion was abominable, of course, in the Soviet days. It has gone down quite a bit. It's a very healthy trend. that has to do with different things. Some of the constraints on abortion look pretty reasonable and actually not dissimilar from liberal nations. When the church tried to inculcate its own ideas on abortion as a sin and just zero tolerance on abortion, it has not been popular with the people at all. If you look at the statistics, there are at least 2/3 of the Russian population who say abortion is a private matter of those concerned, families, women, but not, there shouldn't be any intrusion. Now, the contradiction that you saw, the government intruding on private public spheres, my point is that these attempts are generally unsuccessful. And when it comes to, of course, not to political activists, we heard very good assessments on actually zero tolerance that the government is showing toward political activists. On things that are everyday, I think people generally are left to their own devices if we're talking about people at large.
I would second that. I don't consider traditionalism an ideology, despite the last 3 letters, because I think to qualify as an ideology, there must be a blueprint for the future and a kind of programmatic sense of how we get from our dissatisfaction with the status quo to a new form of society and of politics. So traditionalism to me is not an ideology, and as Masha put it, I think very powerfully in her paper, it's not always clear what counts as tradition in today's Russia, precisely because of the repeated ruptures in moral values and the relationship of the state to those values across the 20th century. It's really an open contest what tradition means in today's Russia. I also want to just highlight something she passed over quickly. One of the distinguishing features of nationalism or nationalist sentiment as managed by the Kremlin is that it does not take the form of, generally speaking, of chauvinism and xenophobia. One of the things I worry most about post-Putin Russia is Putin is an outlier in this sense, and I think the more typical and normal version of nationalism would be one that could provoke a tremendous amount of violence or, as you say, dark forces. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on the way the Kremlin manages what is still a multinational, multi-ethnic society. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Then we will break for lunch for exactly 1 hour, and please be back here at 1:45 when we're going to talk about one topic that we hear too little about, Russia beyond Moscow. But before you leave now, please join me in thanking Masha and Ben for excellent